Barış Arduç moves on, but not the way you think. When one of Turkey's most beloved television stars suddenly vanished from the spotlight, fans assumed they knew exactly what was happening. A private heartbreak. A quiet retreat. Time away from the cameras to heal. But what actually unfolded behind closed doors would reveal something far more complicated than anyone anticipated. This isn't just a story about moving on after a public relationship. This is about a man caught between two versions of himself, and the moment everything he built started to crack. For years, Barış Arduç represented something rare in the Turkish entertainment industry. The charming leading man. The dependable romantic hero. The actor who turned every television drama into a cultural phenomenon. His face became synonymous with passion, loyalty, and that almost impossible balance between fame and authenticity. But somewhere between the final episodes of his last major series and the whispers that began circulating online, something shifted. And the shift wasn't what his millions of followers were prepared for. It started quietly. A few missed appearances. A sudden absence from promotional events that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Social media accounts that once buzzed with constant updates went silent. His team offered vague statements about focusing on new projects, about taking time for personal growth. Standard industry language that usually means absolutely nothing. Fans nodded along, assuming they understood the subtext. He was healing. He was protecting his privacy. He was doing what any person would do after the end of a high-profile relationship. But behind the carefully crafted public narrative, a completely different reality was taking shape. Sources close to the actor began hinting at something unexpected. This wasn't a retreat. This wasn't a man nursing wounds in private. Barış Arduç was actively reinventing himself, and the direction he chose shocked even those who thought they knew him best. Let's go back for a moment. Barış Arduç didn't stumble into fame. He earned it. Drama after drama, he delivered performances that turned casual viewers into obsessed fans. His on-screen chemistry became the standard others were measured against. When he landed the lead role in a series that would dominate Turkish television for years, it wasn't just his career that exploded. It was his entire public identity. He became the romantic ideal, the man women dreamed about, and men wanted to befriend. Magazine covers, brand partnerships, a social media following that crossed into the tens of millions. And then came the relationship that seemed to confirm everything fans believed about him. A romance that played out partially in public, partially behind carefully guarded privacy. The kind of love story that felt both aspirational and real. For years, the narrative was perfect. Too perfect, some would later say. Because when it ended, the silence was deafening. The breakup itself wasn't scandalous in the traditional sense. No explosive fights caught on camera. No cheating allegations splashed across tabloid headlines. Just a quiet, almost too dignified separation that left fans mourning what felt like the end of an era. Barış remained respectful. His former partner did the same. Everyone acted exactly how you're supposed to act when something beautiful comes to an end. But here's where the story takes its first real turn. While the public focused on what had ended, very few were paying attention to what was beginning. Barış Arduç wasn't just moving on emotionally. He was moving on professionally, creatively, and personally in ways that didn't fit the narrative anyone expected. Reports began surfacing about new projects. Not the kind of projects that made him famous. Not another sweeping romantic drama where he'd play the devoted lover opposite another rising star. Instead, whispers emerged about darker material. Grittier roles. Characters that existed in moral, gray areas. Scripts that would challenge everything his fanbase associated with him. For an actor who built an empire playing heroes, this was a radical departure. Industry insiders started talking. Some expressed excitement about an actor pushing boundaries. Others questioned whether Barış understood the risks. Turkish television audiences are fiercely loyal, but that loyalty comes with expectations. You don't just pivot away from what made you beloved without consequences. You don't trade romance for darkness and assume everyone will follow. But the professional pivot was only part of the equation. What really started catching attention were the personal changes. Barış began appearing in different circles. New friendships with artists, directors, and creatives from worlds he'd never publicly engaged with before. His social media, when it did occasionally update, showed a man exploring philosophies, literature, and artistic movements that felt worlds away from the glossy celebrity image he'd maintained for years. Fans were confused. Some were intrigued. Others felt betrayed, as if the man they'd supported through every career milestone was suddenly rejecting the very things that connected them. Online forums filled with speculation. Was this a genuine evolution or an identity crisis playing out in public? Was Barış Arduç finding himself, or was he losing himself? And then came the photographs. Paparazzi images that would ignite the internet for weeks. Barış spotted in locations that didn't match his usual patterns. Not at glamorous events or exclusive restaurants, but at underground art exhibitions, independent film screenings, philosophy lectures. He looked different too. The carefully maintained appearance had shifted. More casual. More raw. Less concerned with maintaining the polished image that had defined him. The internet quickly exploded with reactions. Fan pages split into factions. Some celebrated what they saw as authenticity finally emerging. A man tired of playing a character in his own life, now embracing something real. Others mourned what felt like the loss of someone they thought they knew. The romantic leading man was disappearing, and in his place was someone harder to categorize, harder to understand. But the most revealing moment came from something barely anyone noticed at first. A small interview with an independent film director who mentioned, almost in passing, that Barış Arduç had reached out personally about a project. Not through agents or managers, but directly. A script about a man grappling with the suffocating weight of public expectation. A character who couldn't reconcile who he was with who everyone needed him to be. The parallels were impossible to ignore. This wasn't just an actor choosing an interesting role. This was someone using his craft to process something deeply personal. And suddenly, all the changes, all the mysterious behavior, all the departures from expectations started to make a different kind of sense. Behind the scenes, tensions were growing within his professional team. Management wanted him to capitalize on his name recognition with safe, lucrative projects. Brand partnerships were being offered that would have guaranteed financial security for years. But according to sources close to the situation, Barış was turning them down. Not all of them, but enough to cause concern. He was prioritizing creative fulfillment over commercial success, and in an industry built on commercial success, that decision raised alarms. Financial pressures began mounting. Not catastrophic, but real. When you've built a lifestyle around a certain level of income and then start making choices that reduce that income, the mathematics change quickly. Friends close to the actor reported growing stress. Not about money specifically, but about the gap between what he wanted and what the industry expected from him. He was discovering what many artists eventually learn. True creative freedom is expensive, and the cost isn't always just financial. Meanwhile, public perception continued to fracture. Entertainment journalists who'd written glowing profiles for years started publishing more critical pieces. Questions about whether Barış Arduç was sabotaging his own career. Think pieces about celebrities who couldn't handle success. Hot takes suggesting this was all a publicity stunt, a manufactured reinvention designed to stay relevant. But those closest to the situation told a different story. This wasn't calculated. This wasn't strategy. This was something messier and more human. A person hitting a point where maintaining the facade became more exhausting than facing the consequences of dropping it. Then came the revelation that reframed everything. A long-form interview, the first substantial one Barış had given in over a year. Not with a major entertainment outlet, but with an arts and culture publication most of his mainstream fans had never heard of. In it, he spoke with a candor that was startling. He talked about the loneliness of being loved for a version of yourself that isn't complete. About the weight of knowing millions of people have invested emotionally in an image you're not sure you can sustain. About waking up successful and respected and still feeling profoundly disconnected. He didn't mention his past relationship directly, but the subtext was clear. The end of that chapter hadn't just been about two people growing apart. It had been a catalyst. A moment that forced him to confront questions he'd been avoiding for years. Who was he without the roles? Without the image? Without the constant performance? The interview went viral, but not in the way his team probably hoped. It became a cultural Rorschach test. Some readers found it deeply moving, a rare moment of celebrity vulnerability. Others found it self-indulgent, the complaints of someone who had everything and couldn't appreciate it. Online discourse became brutal. Fan communities that had once united in support of Barış now argued viciously about whether his evolution was brave or insulting. What started as a rumor soon became impossible to ignore. Major television networks that would have offered him lead roles without hesitation were now hesitant. Not because he wasn't talented, but because he'd become unpredictable. In an industry that values reliability, unpredictability is a liability. Brands began distancing themselves. Partnership deals quietly failed to renew. His social media following, once a source of constant engagement, began to shift. The numbers didn't drop dramatically, but the nature of the interaction changed. Less adoration, more debate. Every post became a referendum on whether he was being authentic or pretentious, whether he deserved sympathy or criticism, whether his struggles were real or performative. Behind this very public questioning, Barış continued working. The projects he chose were small but significant. Independent films that would never achieve the viewership of his television work, but might offer something more lasting. Theater productions that paid almost nothing but challenged him in ways commercial television never had. He was building a new kind of career, but the foundation was unstable. Family dynamics added another layer of complexity. According to sources familiar with the situation, those closest to him were divided. Some family members supported his choices, seeing them as necessary growth. Others worried openly about his future, about financial stability, about the risks of alienating the fan base that had given him everything. Family gatherings became tense. Well-meaning advice felt like pressure. Support felt conditional. The emotional toll became visible. Photographs from this period show someone carrying weight that isn't physical. The easy charm that once defined his public appearances was gone. In its place was something more guarded, more cautious. He looked like someone constantly bracing for judgment, and given the online climate, that wasn't paranoia. What happened next stunned fans who'd been following every development. A major announcement, but not the one anyone anticipated. Barış Arduç was leaving Turkey. Not permanently, but for an extended period. He'd been accepted into an international workshop for actors and filmmakers. A prestigious program, but one that would take him completely out of the Turkish entertainment ecosystem for months. The reactions were immediate and split. Industry observers saw it as career suicide. You don't leave your home market when you're already facing questions about your commitment and viability. You don't go silent when you need to be rebuilding bridges. But others saw it differently, as the only move that made sense for someone choosing artistic development over commercial calculation. Behind closed doors, the financial reality was becoming more pressing. Extended time away meant turning down work. It meant existing income streams drying up. It meant relying on savings and hoping the investment in himself would eventually pay dividends. Friends reported that Barış seemed both terrified and liberated by the decision, like someone jumping off a cliff and trusting they'd figure out how to fly on the way down. The departure itself was quiet. No big farewell posts. No dramatic airport photographs. Just a gradual absence that slowly became noticeable. His social media went nearly silent. Sightings stopped. The constant content that had fed his online presence for years just evaporated. In that silence, something interesting happened. The narrative began to shift again. Without new information to dissect, fans started reflecting on the journey itself. Long threads appeared analyzing his career choices, his public statements, the trajectory from beloved star to controversial figure. Some of the harshest critics softened, acknowledging the courage it takes to risk everything comfortable for something uncertain. But the industry didn't soften. Television executives moved on. New faces filled the romantic lead roles Barış would have once been offered by default. The machine kept running, and it ran without him. The brutal truth of celebrity became obvious. You're essential until you're not, and the transition happens faster than anyone wants to believe. Months passed. Occasional updates filtered through. Barış was thriving in the workshop. He was working on material that excited him. He seemed happier, more centered. But happiness doesn't pay bills, and centeredness doesn't rebuild a career. The clock was ticking on how long this experiment could last before practical reality demanded compromise. Then came the news that complicated everything further. One of the independent films he'd shot before leaving, a project almost no one had paid attention to, got accepted into a major international film festival. Not just accepted, but selected for competition. Suddenly, Barış Arduç had something none of his commercial success had ever provided. Serious artistic credibility outside Turkey. The Turkish media, which had largely written him off, suddenly remembered he existed. Articles appeared framing his journey as a calculated master plan, as if every risky decision had been leading to this moment of validation. The narrative flipped so quickly it gave whiplash. The same outlets that questioned his choices now celebrated his vision. But Barış himself remained largely silent. A brief statement thanking the festival and his collaborators.
No triumphant declarations.
No I told you so moments. Just quiet acknowledgement, and then back to the work. The film's actual reception at the festival was mixed. Critics praised his performance, noting a depth and vulnerability they hadn't seen in his television work. But the film itself divided audiences. Too slow for some. Too cerebral. The kind of project that earns respect without becoming popular. Exactly the trade-off his entire journey had represented. What the festival appearance did provide was options. International agents started paying attention. Offers came for projects in different markets, different languages. Nothing massive, but opportunities that wouldn't have existed if he'd stayed safely within the Turkish television system. The gamble hadn't failed, but it hadn't clearly succeeded either. He'd traded one kind of career for another, and the final verdict was still pending. Back in Turkey, his absence had created a strange void. New actors had risen, but none quite captured what Barış had represented. Fans who'd moved on found themselves nostalgic. Social media posts from his earlier work continued circulating, often with captions mourning what felt like a simpler time. The man himself had become almost mythical. More discussed as an idea than as a present reality. The financial pressures, according to those close to the situation, remained significant. International opportunities paid differently than Turkish television stardom. The lifestyle had to change. Not dramatically, not publicly, but enough to matter. Choices about where to live, what to drive, how to exist in the world all recalibrated to a new economic reality. And throughout all of this, the personal question remained unanswered. Had Barış Arduç actually moved on? Not just from a relationship, but from the version of himself that relationship represented? Or was this entire journey an elaborate form of running away? The truth, as always, was probably more complicated than either narrative allowed. Recent months have brought new developments. Barış returned to Turkey, but quietly. No big announcements. No press tours. Just a gradual reemergence into familiar spaces. But he's different now. The changes that started as shocking have settled into who he is. The experimental phase has become his reality. Industry insiders report that he's being offered work again, but different work. Character roles instead of leads. Supporting parts in prestigious projects instead of carrying commercial ones. The offers reflect respect for his choices, but also acknowledgement that the old path is closed. You don't get to walk away and then walk back to exactly where you were. His social media has resumed, but with a different energy. Less frequent. More intentional. Posts that feel personal rather than promotional. The relationship with his audience has changed. Smaller but more genuine. Less parasocial worship, more mutual respect. It's unclear if this is sustainable long-term, but for now, it's what exists. The bigger question hovering over everything is what comes next. Barış Arduç is still young enough to have a second act, maybe even a third. But the choices he made ensure those acts won't look like the first. He's an artist now in ways he wasn't before, but artists in the entertainment industry face different challenges than stars. Stars get opportunities. Artists have to create them. Friends say he seems more at peace, even with the uncertainty. That the stress of maintaining an image was more destructive than the stress of building something authentic. That he'd rather struggle towards something real than succeed at something false. It's a beautiful sentiment, and maybe it's even true. But it's also the kind of thing people say when they're trying to convince themselves their sacrifices were worth it. The romantic relationship that preceded all of this has faded into background context. Both parties have moved forward with their lives. Occasional sightings, occasional projects, but the obsessive public interest has cooled. In hindsight, the relationship's end wasn't the story. It was just the inciting incident for a much more complex narrative about identity, authenticity, and the cost of choosing yourself over expectation. For fans who've followed this entire journey, the emotions remain complicated. Pride mixed with loss, respect mixed with resentment, a wish that he could have evolved without disappearing, a recognition that maybe disappearing was the only way evolution was possible. There's no clean resolution because this isn't that kind of story. The Turkish entertainment industry has absorbed his absence and adapted. The machine always does. New stars rise. Old stars fade. The ecosystem maintains balance regardless of individual trajectories. Barış Arduç's choice to step away proved both that he was special and that no one is irreplaceable. Both things can be true. What this story reveals, more than anything, is the impossible tension at the heart of celebrity. The public creates stars by projecting their desires and dreams onto real human beings. And then they're shocked when those human beings turn out to have their own desires and dreams that don't align with the projection. Barış Arduç didn't betray anyone by choosing a different path. But it felt like betrayal to people who'd invested emotionally in a version of him that was always incomplete. The future remains genuinely uncertain. Will the artistic credibility translate into sustainable career opportunities? Will the Turkish industry eventually welcome him back fully? Or will he remain perpetually adjacent to mainstream success? Will he look back on these choices with satisfaction or regret? No one knows, possibly including Barış himself. What we're witnessing is still unfolding. This isn't a finished story with a neat conclusion. It's a life being lived in real time, with all the messiness that entails. The man who was once Turkey's most reliable romantic leading man is now something harder to define. An actor. An artist. A person trying to reconcile public identity with private truth. For everyone watching, this journey offers a strange mirror. How many of us have felt trapped by others' expectations? How many have wanted to burn it all down and start over as something more authentic? Barış Arduç actually did it, and the result is neither triumph nor disaster. It's just different. Harder in some ways. More fulfilling in others. More honest, definitely. The cameras that once followed his every move have mostly turned elsewhere. The spotlight that defined his 20s and early 30s now illuminates other faces. And in that relative darkness, Barış Arduç is building something that might matter more than anything he did in the light. Or he's not. Time will tell. For a man who spent years being exactly what everyone needed him to be, this moment of uncertainty might be the most honest thing he's ever done. The performance is over. What remains is just a person, talented and flawed and searching. That's not the fairy tale his fans signed up for, but it might be the only story worth telling. And whether it ends in redemption, reinvention, or something else entirely, at least it will be real. For someone who's spent years living in fantasy, that might finally be enough.